Cool.
Now.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. It's already 1 past the hour, so I think I'll go ahead and get started as people continue to roll in. Happy today to, first of all, welcome to the Center for Cultural Affairs workshop series in Cultural Affairs. My name is Joanna Veronkovich. I'm the co-founder and co-director here for the Center for Cultural Affairs. Happy to have you all here with us today. This semester slash part of the series has really gone very, very quickly. We're almost at the end of it, which is amazing to me. We have 2 days until November, but I'm very happy to introduce our speaker today, who we have not had on the workshop before. So we have Christos Makridis from Arizona State University, and he will be discussing and presenting his paper today on the geography and returns to private arts organizations. So at this point, I'm just going to pass it to Christos, and Christos, you can provide more of an introduction if you please. And just as a reminder to our audience, we will probably hear from Christos for about 30 minutes. And you can feel free to put questions in the chat, but we'll have a discussion period at the end of the session for 30 minutes through the chat and both the audio Zoom. So I will pass it over to you, Christos.
Awesome. Thanks so much again for the opportunity to be here. Thank you everybody that is here and taking the time to listen to this. I'm excited as well just for the overall series and for the opportunity to tune in myself as a listener in the weeks and months ahead. I was joking with Becca at the beginning, like maybe a couple of weeks ago, that I was going to I'm in Athens right now. I've been working in Athens for the past month for a couple different projects, and I was like, it'd be so fitting to like do this on like the Parthenon or something like that. But I'm instead just in a Greek house. So if you saw the background, it would like look totally Greek, and it's a nice house. Anyways, so today, as you can see the title, we're talking about estimating what the average individual, what the average citizen is willing to pay for arts amenities. And I've been debating about whether to change the title, because the part about private arts organizations sometimes can be a little bit, it can create a little bit of confusion. But the main distinction, just to get that out of the way before jumping into the kind of content of the talk, is to say there's like public museums. So you go to Washington, D.C., you've got the Smithsonian, you've got tons and tons of museums. That is not as much what I'm looking at here, not because it's not interesting. In fact, I actually want to include those in my sample. It was a function of data, namely that in the public QCEW, which I'll get into and I'll explain all the different data sources in a couple minutes, but in that data, there was a lot of censoring in the publicly available files. I requested and am going through the access to restricted data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and hopefully that request gets granted in the not too distant future. So the new title, if you ask me in another 6 months or a year or whenever it takes for the access to be approved, might be the geography and returns to arts organizations and not to private arts organizations. But that's just a small disclaimer right now. Additional disclaimer is the usual: my views don't reflect the views of all my associations and the role I have in the federal government. Today is just going to be about arts and estimating the returns to this. So let me actually put this on full screen, because I think it's just or on screen. Let's see, full screen mode. Here we go. Okie dokie. So not that this particular audience, we need much motivation. This is already an issue that we care about and are tracking, but just to really underscore the point, namely that there's been a lot of challenges that arts institutions have faced, not only over the past 4 years, but also, past couple of decades. There's been a lot of changes in the classical music sector. For example, the Metropolitan Opera in New York City has been struggling to reach pre-pandemic levels of attendance, and this is true for many different theaters. So what this paper is going to do is the backdrop of it is that there's a lot of surveyed evidence that people support the arts. I mean, you go to the average person on the street, it's like what person would say arts and culture is not important? One of the frustrating aspects sometimes, and I think that we can face in our community is in the academic literature. Sometimes we might submit a paper and then somebody says, "Oh, it's just a niche interest," but arts and culture is not a niche interest. It's quite inherent to basically the way that we live our lives. We want to dress well. We want to have nice architecture. We want to have nice food. It's part of it's so ingrained actually in our day to day that we sometimes can be dismissive of it, of the importance of it. So there's been, I mean, I don't mean to, bullet point number two is not to trivialize the vast body of work that does exist, but compared to other fields, like I come from in economics, you have like an asset pricing there. I mean, there's like a million papers on asset pricing where you put one more factor on the right-hand side and see what explanatory power that it has, or all the difference in difference regressions that are applied to corporate governance. And in my view, it seems like there's been less attention in economics paid to the arts, and I'm excited that this community today brings together a larger interdisciplinary community, not just economists. There was also a nice BEA report that came out a couple of years ago around the impact that the arts and culture sector has on GDP, and so with that's additional backdrop. From the economics perspective, why do the arts matter? I think there's maybe three main reasons. I'm sure we could list more, but I think that they fall into these three buckets, namely one, that as an economy grows and develops economically and so on, there is a greater demand for amenities. And amenities range from like air quality, school quality, water quality, but also arts and culture, restaurants, and so on. So there's a number of amenities that grow as an economy develops. Number two, there's potentially strong reasons. And I haven't seen a lot of good, super solid empirical evidence on this, but it seems to be an argument that I would buy, and there's some empirical evidence that arts brings people together around a common set of ideals, and it can help reduce some of the factions and fragmentation and polarization that we see. And number three, arts can inspire better behavior and enhance community outcomes by providing opportunities for edifying settings and for families to go to events together. And that's something that I certainly see a lot in Vienna, where, I mean, kids are growing up going to the Magic Flute when they're like tiny, and then they continue and have that exposure to the fine arts as they get older. So what's this paper going to do now that I've gotten the backdrop out of this? The first part is going to be a little bit more descriptive. I'm going to present data from the QCW, and I'm actually going to show, and this surprised me a lot, and well, let me state the result, and then I'll put the caveat. So contrary to public belief, the number of and the share of arts establishments seems to have grown in the average county. Number two, both the level and the growth of artistic services seem to be concentrated a little bit in the Southwest, and then you see obviously the Northeast with New York and all the amenities that are up there. And then the growth in establishments seems to be matched by an increase in artistic employment in these counties. And so there is sometimes like this prevailing view that, or at least in the press, around the erosion of the arts. And of course, there is financial precarity that artists face, and that folks in this audience have written about plenty, but it was interesting to see that this came through in the aggregate data. The caveat here, and I'm going to talk more about this in maybe 3 slides when I get very specific about the data, but the public QCEW data, the quarterly census of employment and wages, there is censoring that takes place within certain cells of the data. So when you cut it by like 3 or 4 digit NAICS by county, by year, but basically NAICS by county, you have certain cells that are censored because the BLS is worried about disclosure of sensitive information. And as a result, they just put a missing value. And so one possibility is that based on that censoring, you could get a very different aggregate picture once you include what's actually going on. Now, I don't think that's a risk, and that's why I'm going to present the results today, because they're censored because it's a very small sample. So if it's a small sample, even if it's biased towards there being a big decline, that's still at a weighted level. It's still going to be a smaller, much smaller overall share in terms of the total. So point number one is all descriptive. Point number two, and this is mainly where the causal analysis comes in, is estimating a marginal willingness to pay for arts and culture amenities. The main kind of baseline estimate says a 10% increase in the number of establishments, arts establishments, is associated with a 1.7 to a 4.8% increase in house prices. And I do a bunch of different robustness exercises, one of which is just changing the main measure of arts amenities, because it's one of those things that's sort of hard to put a clear like umbrella around and say, this is art. Obviously, the creative economy takes many shapes and sizes. So I'm going to use a NAICS-based industry classification, but you can also use just look at employment in the arts and not just establishments and find a somewhat similar qualitative result. And then lastly, I want to emphasize that there's a lot of heterogeneity in where these effects are concentrated. And so these elasticity estimates can be used to then obtain an aggregate willingness to pay for arts amenities, and that's kind of where the paper ends. So to start, let me talk a little bit about the data and methodology, and then we'll start transitioning to the results. So I mentioned before, I'm using the QCW, the Quarterly Census of Employment and Wages. It's sort of viewed as the gold standard for labor market related work, because every state has to report their labor market data to the Unemployment Insurance Agency for the disbursement of UI benefits. And so it covers basically the entire economy in the United States. And it does a really good job, particularly in the private sector, of measuring employment, number of establishments, wages, and then, as I mentioned, I'm trying to get access to the restricted data that I could work with in an RDC. And what that would allow, well, I mean, it would allow a number of additional things. One is you would see the employer. Number two is that you wouldn't be faced with the same censoring problem. And so actually, just to give you a sense of the censoring, and then I'll come back to this this page is, for example, don't worry about what this plot is showing. I'll tell you about it in more detail when we get to it. But all the gray is basically the censoring. So there's a lot of the United States when you're using when you're looking at changes where there is missing data, and as a result, having access to the RDC data would obviate that challenge. Okay. Housing price data. There's one of my dear friends and co-authors, a gentleman named William Larson, wrote a paper with Bogan and another co-author that got published in Real Estate Economics. They used transaction level data from the FHFA, and they created housing price indices at a county, zip code, state, CBSA level, by year level. This data is extremely valuable because oftentimes you want to work with transaction level data because you're able to control for composition effects in the quality of housing. So number of bedrooms, all sorts of amenities that might typically be on the right-hand side. But getting access to that data is not easy. I've worked with CoreLogic data, and it's very messy, and Zillow data is a little bit better, but they have some imputations and so on. So the beauty of this data is that it was created using gold standard data at the FHFA, and it controls for these composition effects. And then lastly, I'm going to use some data from, actually, I shouldn't say lastly, there's actually a few other data sets that I bring in, but are not featured as prominently and are used more for robustness. But number three is the Census Bureau's county to county migration flows data. And this data is very interesting because you can see the number of people that are going from county I to county J from year to year. And I'm going to use this to construct a Bartik-like instrument to have some evidence of exogeneity in the causal analysis. Okay, so before we get to descriptive results number one, I want to be clear about the measure of the arts that I'm using. And this is not a perfect measure by any means, but it's given the data that we have, it's not as if we can see occupation. And so you sort of have to rely on industry classifications. And so a practical challenge with the public data is that there's a lot of censoring at the 4-digit level. So what I do is I take NAICS 71. So when you work at a 2-digit level, there's going to be less censoring by definition because it's a higher level of aggregation. And then I net out the 3-digit NAICS code that refers to amusement parks, gambling, and recreation. And if you look, basically, the residual of that in 71 minus the amusement, gambling, and recreation sort of captures what we would typically think of arts establishments, museums, performing arts, etc. And to suggest that this is a reasonable proxy for genuine arts amenities, namely if we could work at a 4-digit level, which is the ideal, I have two robustness exercises. And so the first one, and actually let me not just continue giving a monologue. Let me show you the plot. So what this is doing is we say, what if we didn't care about the county and we just wanted to look at the national average? And what I can do is just compute the direct measure using the 4-digit NAICS code, and again, not worry about county. So this is just 4-digit NAICS over time, and that's in the blue. And then the indirect measure is the measure that I'm creating, but then I'm just aggregating up to an annual level, summing across all industries. And so basically, you see that there's a correlation of 1 between the two, and even though it seems to not be exactly the same level, so it's maybe 0.002 off in terms of employment share, it's tracking fairly, not fairly well, it's tracking at an A+ level. So that was one confirming piece of evidence. The second is to get at a county level, we can compute for the sample of counties where I see 4-digit information. And then there's some overlap. Obviously, it's you basically at a 2-digit level, that's going to be the bigger sample, and then a subset of that is going to be at a 4-digit by county by year level. You can compute these two measures, direct and indirect, and find that there's a 0.88 correlation between the two. And it's not just like a positive correlation. It seems to be kind of like perfectly monotone and 45 degrees. So this is just a bin scatter of that. So again, even if you just look at the national and then you look at a county for the counties where that information is available, it seems to map quite well. Okay, so takeaway so far is my measure of arts and cultural amenities is going to be based off of a NAICS classification, and I'm netting out amusement, gambling, and recreation. So if we take that approach, what does it look like in the actual raw data? And what we can see is that there's this concentration. This is just looking, top panel is looking at establishments per capita, and then the bottom panel is establishments per capita when you focus specifically on the arts. So NAICS 71 is like the broad category. NAICS and then arts is netting out amusement, gambling, and recreation. And so there's a correlation between the two, but it seems to, but there are some differences as well. So you see kind of like in the northeast, and then you see a little bit in the southwest. You see a little bit in the northwest as well. And again, just a little bit of a visual. If we look at growth rates, that's another kind of question is, okay, what's the level? Oh, and I should also clarify, this is per capita. So it's not just capturing population differences, because that would be the obvious thing of, okay, of course, New York City is going to have, or New York as a whole is going to have more arts establishments, but we normalize by population. Okay, so now there's a lot of censoring when you use, when you look at changes over time. This is looking between 2000 and 2022. But on the sample that I do observe, there is the average, the median seems to have this positive growth. Of course, there's places that see a decline in the number of establishments. And again, just a bit of a visual. I'm trying to think about, is there anything super interesting to point out? I always find these heat maps just kind of interesting to look at, not because there's a clear takeaway, but growing up in Arizona, this has been one thing that I can tell a tiny personal story about. So my parents moved to Arizona back when it was like a desert. It was like 50 years ago. There wasn't much development in Phoenix, Arizona. And so I grew up in Phoenix, and my parents have had a Greek restaurant there for, I mean, basically the entire time. It's like going into 47 years. And I never really had an appreciation for Mediterranean food growing up, because it was like all I had. And then after I graduated from the beauty of living with your parents and going to undergrad and then going to a doctoral program, I realized, number one, tzatziki and hummus is not exactly easy to make, and number two, that it's actually extremely tasty, and I never seem to tire of it. But anyways, the main point that I was going for was namely that places like Phoenix, Arizona have just really ballooned in terms of not only population, but arts and cultural amenities. And then you obviously see Florida, Texas. There's also been a big explosion in places like Austin and Houston. Houston has actually always seems to have had a large community because there's been so much revenue generated from the oil sector. And then you have a bunch of people that are like, well, we don't just want to have oil refineries. We want to have some cultural amenities. And so there's been a lot in the fashion and cultural sector there. Okay, let me keep moving for sake of time. We can produce similar plots with looking at establishments, and but let me get to the main analysis. Okay. The conceptual framework for the empirical estimation is just going to rely on a basic Rosen model where we can decompose housing prices as a function of characteristics, and then the individual's utility is going to be a function of housing characteristics, amenities, and then we're going to control for some other factors. And that basically, skipping like decades of kind of theorizing, is going to lead to a simple estimated equation that we all know and love very well, namely this hedonic pricing equation where we relate housing prices with various amenities, a vector of amenities. We call it A, referring to log number of arts establishments. X is going to be a vector of time-varying county controls. Phi and lambda are going to be fixed effects on county and year. And what this is going to allow me to do is to isolate within county variation in arts amenities after controlling for other potential confounding factors. So, of course, there's a lot of potential concerns with this and reasons why it's not simple. And I also want to say there's been people that have attempted versions of this before. There's a number of papers that I obviously I didn't want to spend, since it's only an hour, I didn't want to spend like 20 minutes just doing a big background slide. So there's a number of papers that look at, for example, the effects of museums on areas. There's a couple of recent papers on the designation of cultural districts, of which, I mean, Doug obviously has papers on as well, and what that does to property values and kind of cultural development in an area. But again, kind of skipping that background just to say one of the big concerns is omitted variables bias. And there's kind of two variations here. Number one is that areas with arts amenities likely have people that are higher income because they're individuals that may be willing to pay for those amenities. And then number two, non-random sorting means that people that have preferences for those amenities will specifically select into those areas, and they're potentially willing to incur a compensating differential in the labor market where they take a lower wage to be closer to amenities that they are that are there. There's actually, I just heard this story today. I was talking with a dear friend here in Greece, and he was telling me, because he used to live in the United States and in DC, he was telling me about a friend of his. This is an amazing story. It's like real estate. It's the best part of real estate, I guess, but you don't always get it in real estate. So the person bought a place right next to the Kennedy Center in DC, and if we had Q&A right now, I would like ask y'all to guess how much the person bought it for. But I'll tell you, it was just $1,000. So it was like a very bad area right next to the Kennedy Center, and then like 20, 30 years later, it's like from 1,000 to now it's like, I don't know, 2 million or something like that. And so anyways, just point being, there's a lot of omitted variables. Okay, we're not here for the stories, we're here for the econometrics. So what do I do to solve this problem? Number one is putting in state by year fixed effects. One of the big concerns is that states are implementing a lot of different policies, labor markets are changing, there's technological change at a state level, especially you have some states, in Phoenix in particular, for example, will attract companies to be there. Intel was a big one, partnerships with different universities, since that can change the labor market. Number two is controlling for overall employment, overall establishments, and population growth, all at a county level. So what I'm going to try to hone in on is that variation that's unique about arts establishments, purging variation about a labor market as a whole. Number three is implementing a Bartek-like instrument, which I will show in the next slide. And then sort of like the reason why the appendix of this paper is something like 50 pages is because I do a bunch of different robustness exercises. One of them is exploiting variation from the pandemic. And the idea is that areas where the lockdowns were longer may have had a larger effect on housing prices because they might have been anticipated because people weren't sure. I mean, we were all unsure, like how long are things going to last? And so the longer the lockdown, the bigger effect it might have had on prices, and that length might be plausibly exogenous. And so again, we can get into that more later, and I'll show you the results on that later. They line up with what we would expect. Another dear friend of mine, Jacob Brownstein, is a postdoc at the Institute of Fiscal Studies in the UK, and he's been doing some really cool historical economic history work around the New Deal. And he has a paper that I recommend reading where he studies New Deal funding for artists. And so he graciously provided me with access to the data that he collected. And what I use here is variation in how much a city received in funding from the New Deal specifically to the arts. And it turns out, even though this instrument is not super strong, I think the F stat is something like 8 or 11, depending on the controls that one puts in. It also generates somewhat similar results. And basically, I've kept adding more and more robustness to this paper as concerns come up. So another thing that I don't mention here, but I collected data from the IRS where and actually Doug and I were talking about this a few weeks ago, where nonprofits report, and public charities basically have to report donations, revenue, et cetera. And so I also replicate all the analysis that I'm going to show you at a zip code level, where the right-hand side variable is the number of public arts, the number of arts and culture charities at a zip code level, and then I put in county and year fixed effects. I can also control for other factors about the arts charity. So anyways, just to tell you, I'm not overlooking identification concerns. I'm trying to take it extremely seriously. But since I'm actually realizing that we are running up on time for the first 30 minutes, let me hastily get through the Bartik, and I will wave my hands a little bit and open it up for questions afterwards, and then I will land the plane with the results. But the basic idea behind the Bartik instrument was I want to exploit exposure to areas that have a greater concentration of artists. So if I'm living in Phoenix, and Phoenix is more connected with San Francisco compared to San Antonio, and San Francisco has more artists, and more people from San Francisco are coming to Phoenix, then that should impact the supply of arts in Phoenix more compared to another place that's more connected with Austin than it is in San Francisco. And that's basically the idea. Like M is a big matrix. It's like a county by county matrix that just displays the flows. And then A subscript C prime T is the artists, whatever measure we want to use, art establishment growth, for example, in the connected C prime county in time period T. And so aggregate across, and then you have this Bartik instrument. Okay, then two-stage least squares, blah, blah, blah. Control for overall inflows, because some areas might vary for unobserved reasons because they're just more desirable to live in. And first stage effect, it's there. It's not like absurdly strong, but it's strong enough. There's a correlation. And this is like partial, this is the residualized. So it's not just like capturing like levels. This is residualizing for other factors. Let me skip the justification, and maybe we'll come back to that later. Okay, what have we all been waiting for? The one regression table that suggests that there's maybe a little bit of causality. So this is baseline, no IV, and then I'll show you the IV, and then I'll start wrapping up. So column 1 is just showing no controls. This is just like log housing price regressed on log establishments. And really interestingly, if I showed you the effect with the Zillow data instead of the FHFA data, you actually get a very strong like positive coefficient in the raw data, but then it drops significantly as you add other controls. That's very important to me because it tells me that the FHFA data is actually doing a very good job already controlling for composition effects. The fact that it doesn't change that much between columns 1 and 2. So column 2 adds in county fixed effects, year fixed effects. Column 3 adds in these additional county level controls. Column 4 adds in state by year fixed effects. Column 5 starts interacting it with a median, like they basically create an indicator for above or below the median according to different characteristics about an area. So the share of youth. So for example, the share of individuals between like age 25 to 44, and then share high college, low college, over $100,000 in median household income per year, and then population density. And so you can see that there's some kind of intuitive effects here. Although when you do test robustness, some of these don't pop out. So what I do find is robust is the interaction on college and on income. On youth, it sometimes falters, and population density, it seems to be insignificant. This is just basically replicating the result. If instead of log number of arts establishments on the right-hand side, you use number of employment of artists, and then you divide it by population, you put it in per capita. So kind of what I was just saying, these results carry through for college and over 100,000 in median household income, but not for the other two. Now, this is with the Bartik IV. I'm just presenting the kind of key results, not doing all the interactions. So main result is 0.098. It goes down a little bit more to 0.071. This column 2 is what I consider the kind of baseline specification. It's closer to what I think is probably the truth. And I mean, let's see if we just go back to here. So we're comparing 0.017 to 0.071871. IV estimate is higher. There's various reasons for that. I mean, you can see the R squared. Sometimes R squared behaves weird with dependent on the IV. F-stat was coming up to be over 10, even with when I restrict the sample and put in the full set of controls. But anyways, we can go into the IV a little bit more during the discussion potentially. Let me start stopping basically in the next 30 seconds. So robustness with this, we can come back to it. More robustness using this historical variation from the New Deal. This I found to be maybe a more compelling robustness exercise, and had estimates that were closer to the baseline, 0.026 compared to the 0.031. Again, F-stat is kind of low, so it's I mean, it's not at the rule of thumb of 10, but it's close to it. I use IRS data at the zip code level, and can put in full county by year fixed effects, for example, in column 4. The coefficient change is not that different, 0.009 to 0.007. You might be saying, oh, well, these are quantitatively different. Yes, they are, but the right-hand side variable is also different because we're measuring different things. Instead of establishments, it's looking at this IRS data. Again, using contributions and revenue instead of establishments, just a different proxy. And then lastly, and this is what I will conclude on, is we can take those elasticities and then we can obtain an overall willingness to pay based off of like what are housing prices actually at. And what I am sort of finding is that the mean marginal willingness to pay seems to be growing from about $5,000 per year to right under $15,000 per year. The growth is driven in large part by the increase in the cost of housing and overall rise of housing prices. But I found this just really interesting that, I mean, the short answer, do people care about arts and culture charity or organizations? Yes, they do, and they're willing to pay for it. And that's, then I have some discussion about the NEA and future of arts funding. I've been doing some work a little bit in kind of the arts management literature as well. That's another paper of mine, doing some work around blockchain. Think that has possibilities for enriching the arts. But here's the conclusion. And with that, I apologize, I'm 3 minutes over, and we can open it up to Q&A, and I'll take a look at the chat.
Great. Thank you, Christos. So everybody, please do feel free to put your questions in the chat, or raise your hand and I can call on you and ask questions. So one thing I'll just mention.
So great. I just saw Sunil. Glad that you're here, Sunil. Thank you so much as well for your ongoing support. And anyway, sorry to interrupt, Becca. I just saw that.
Joanna, but that's okay.
I'm sorry. Oh, yeah.
That's okay. So, all right. So I think just one comment, which is, I think the paper, just the title of the paper should probably be changed, because it's really a paper about arts amenities and housing, right? So it gets at, I think maybe changing the title would probably signal a little bit better. Now thinking about what it's telling us, right? So we're seeing this positive relationship between arts establishments and uh, housing prices, and then ultimately translate into a willingness to pay or marginal willingness to pay. But that's just based on, right, the one factor that you're looking at in these particular counties, right? So this is just number of arts establishments. So how can you explain and you talk about omitted variable bias, but this 10% elasticity, how do we explain that to somebody who says, well, doesn't aren't there more things about a county or a neighborhood that matters than just the number of arts establishments in there?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, one thing that we could do is kind of do a horse race between all the different types of amenities that are out there. And one that I've done some work over, and maybe I can find let's see if I can find in my broader paper. I'll do this when I'm not answering the question, so I don't keep everybody while I look. But I control for the number of kind of like restaurants and restaurant amenities, and that's kind of related to the Jesse Hanbury and Victor Couture papers on urban amenities. Controlling for that didn't change the results in any statistically significant way. Other things like air quality, things like school quality. That's where I mean, one gathering the data. I was actually, if anyone has access to a great measure of amenity data that varies by time, I would be enormously grateful for your sharing. But that's where the data that I got from the IRS, where I can control for county by year fixed effects, will address that in part. Because unless something's varying at a zip code level, then those additional fixed effects would hopefully cover it. Of course, there could be unobserved variation at a zip code level, which of course there is, but things like air quality, school quality, maybe those are not as significant at a zip code level. But people obviously do move. I mean, people move all the time for school districts that maybe within a zip code. So
Right. You
yeah,
started with the framework of, why do we care about the arts? So, I think it's important to sort of think about how that framework then comes out from your empirical model.
yeah.
So I'm trying to think about like trying to make a stronger connection between your empirical model and its results and trying to answer this overall question, which is why do we care about the arts? And I'm not quite sure whether or not we care about the arts because right, it has a positive association with housing prices. I'm not sure if that's quite the reason. So I don't know, maybe thinking about a different framework that can introduce. That's why I think this is more of a housing paper than it is why do we care about the arts paper? Um,
Well, wait, so I mean, like, there's such a large body of work on revealed preference and people voting with their feet. So the fact that we can use housing prices as an asset to capitalize these amenities is sort of an indication that people are willing to move for those sorts of amenities. That's kind of what I was getting at. Does that clarify, or does?
Yeah, a little bit, but I think just connecting the framework a little bit more strongly to the empirical model, especially the fact that and you kind of went through it really quickly, the fact that you're bringing in this migration data somehow, and I wasn't exactly clear on that because you sort of sped through it, but you know, people are actually changing. I think it's about mobility. People are actually changing their locations in order to be in one place versus another. And that obviously shows that there's some sort of value here. But like making that argument a little bit stronger through your empirical model and saying why that's the case, I think would just overall help with the general framework of the paper. We have a
Thank
question
you.
from Michael, which is applying leads and lags. So obviously trying to get to this issue of what comes first, right? The housing prices or the arts establishments, and whether or not you've had any robustness checks, either leads and lags, or trying to figure out the endogeneity between those two.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, so I mean, I haven't done like a big the short answer is no in terms of like doing like a full impulse response function, because one of the challenges with this public data is that not all the years are so you might have like a county where it's censored in one year but not another year, and that's why you saw a bit of a discrepancy between the levels plots and then the growth rate plot spatial heat maps. And so you end up losing a lot of the sample. And that's why I haven't like pushed the data as hard as I maybe could. That's a great suggestion for me to add. And yeah, maybe just to, yeah, I think, yeah, actually, I've done this sort of analysis in other papers, and it's a great way of, as you said, kind of seeing what comes first. And it would be another robustness exercise to pin down causality. So thank you for that, Michael.
Great. Doug.
Thank you for all that, Christos. It was a tour de force in 30-something minutes. You cranked through a lot. I'll confess I'm a bit confused about some of the real basics on this. Some of it is about the data. So your dependent variable is a price index.
Yeah.
Itself, abstract, arbitrary, arguably almost meaningless thing without much grounding. So it'd be nice to get some more grounding on like what's it. I didn't see any descriptive statistics, for instance, in the paper. I don't even know what it ranges. I don't know anything about that variable. And I think there's a conceptual problem, not problem, challenge or opportunity to try to link a price index to what you've been referring to as a marginal willingness to pay. And this is not a hedonic, right? This is a price index that's derived from hedonics. So you've got a county level indicator of price levels conditional on a bunch of stuff. And now you're predicting that, conditioning it on other things, including the number of arts establishments, which I wasn't sure if that was logged or not in, again, because there were no descriptive stats for the independent variable either. So I get confused about some of those basics and interpreting and how we interpret it sort of in a simple econometric sense, like what's the 0.17 and elasticity of what? But then how do we tie that back to a marginal willingness to pay? If we're running a hedonic to generate price indices, you're already conditioning that price index based on a bunch of other things, usually about a lot of things about housing quality and housing attributes, but also other things about neighborhood attributes. And if the number of arts establishments are part of the neighborhood attributes, that's the premise here, then really the original baseline Bogan hedonics have an omitted variable problem, and that they're omitting this amenity that we think should be in there. And what does it mean then to then on the back end take the price index and reintroduce this omitted variable? How do we interpret that, given that arts establishments should be correlated with a lot of the other amenities that one would normally find in a hedonic?
Yeah, so I guess maybe there's two major questions there. One is just around yeah, no, thanks for that. Yeah, so one is around measurement, and then the other is around interpreting the housing price index. On the measurement side, just I mean, like I used, because a lot of the data is I mean, like so the housing price index, it's normalized to like 100 is the base year. So they start in like you can either have a base year in 1990 that they have or in 2000, and so basically it spans from like 100 to 120 or something like that, or whatever it might be for the given county. So it's in terms of those units. And there's a valid question around, yeah, do you interpret so yeah, measurement and then right hand side is number of establishments, but taking a log of that, or artists per capita, so total employment of artists divided by population. And so could definitely put in additional descriptive stats. The second question, as you kind of mentioned around, can you use a housing price index to then obtain a marginal willingness to pay? Yeah, I mean, so in short, I'm not an expert on the econometrics of this literature, so I should reach out to somebody that is and see maybe is there some theory around the applicability. My understanding was that because this FHFA housing price index has been used a lot, and I can replicate the results using like Zillow data where you see the median housing price. So it's like a dollar value at a county level, county by year. It actually goes down to a monthly level, and like results come through. The elasticity is a little bit different. And actually, let me see if I can find the elasticity and see how different it is. Because that was one, sorry, I'm bringing up my other PDF. Right. And maybe I have it actually in the slides. Let me check. No, I don't. Okay, let's find it. This is a real-time searching.
Right. While you're searching for it, I want to recognize at least some of the other comments in the chat. And I know I'm into standing in the way of Michael asking questions, but
Oh, wait, I just found it really quick. So basically using Zillow generated an almost identical coefficient, 0.017. So this is, if anyone is like getting into the nitty-gritty details of the paper and looking in the appendix, it's in table A2, and the coefficient is 0.017 compared to the baseline, what was it, 0.01. Sorry to interrupt again, but I just figured since I just found it, I might as well mention it. 0.0, darn it, these tables. Yeah, wait, was this like exactly the same? Gosh, maybe it was like exactly the same. I think it might have actually been literally exactly the same, but the standard errors are obviously different. So I don't know if that's like a total fluke or whether there's like actually a good econometric reason where if you have like maybe that I hope somebody has a theory paper about like the equivalence and that if you have a causal parameter, then they should be equivalent. That would be an awesome paper. But okay, that's but turning back to you, Doug, to
so to channel a comment from the chat and also my own thoughts on this. When I see the interaction term with income, apparently driving everything, I wonder how you think of the narrative of this is not about the value that the arts establishments are bringing to proximity and the property value of capitalized value of living near it, but instead it's a story about certain markets are seeing housing affordability go through the roof and prices are being driven up as much from demand as it is from supply constraints. And they happen to be really highly correlated with where we happen to be locating a lot of our arts establishments. So good news, we've got arts establishments in really unaffordable markets. And now we're showing that, yeah, the marginal willingness to pay is really high because the price of housing is really high. And this is not so much causal of that, but is reflecting broader trends in housing market unaffordability. And this happy story of the arts is really just a story of we do a really good job at making arts unaffordable.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I feel like I might have put, gosh, I don't know if I did a robust. I think it might be table A6. Yes. Okay, great. So, yes. Okay. So the short answer is I looked into this in a couple of ways. One was by using like the size elasticity, and I think there might be an update. And I was actually like trying to find the author that did this paper because I saw it like 4 years ago. So let me ask the question that I have in case anyone has the immediate reference and it comes to mind. But then I'll give you the but let me give you the main results. So I interacted. So I took in the Census Bureau. I can see the number of housing units. And I can look at areas where housing has expanded and just do like above, below the median. And one of the things that I did find was that the effects were concentrated in areas that actually saw an expansion of housing supply. So it wasn't just, so really, it seems to be areas that were developing, not just areas where housing prices were going through the roof because housing was constrained, if that makes sense. So I was looking at unit growth, housing supply unit growth from the Census Bureau. So yeah, otherwise that would be a huge problem. And then I would suggest like, hey, these are not really benefits. This is just some distortion. And but yeah, if anyone knows about the paper that came out, I feel like maybe 2-3 years ago around how land elasticity, and they produce it at like a zip code, county, et cetera level. I'd love for you to put it in the chat.
Okay. Michael.
Okay, thank you, Christos. A really interesting paper. I also read one of the SSRN versions of the paper, and the thing you didn't really get much of a chance to go into is discussion of local arts policy, cultural districts, and so on. Although I know that's in the written part of your paper, and you talk about cultural districts and forming them and so on, and that there are positive externalities from the arts. And in listening to the talk today and in reading that, I feel like I've missed something because I don't see anyway how the results of this paper indicate externality effects from the arts. And let me explain this. Just as a complete hypothetical, suppose that consumption of the arts was purely a private good, and that if I go to the theater and enjoy it, that's no different from my going to get a haircut or going to a restaurant and buying a grilled cheese sandwich. All the benefits are mine, but there's no external benefits whatsoever. But I really like theater. I really like live theater. And a complementary good to live theater is housing close to live theater. So I think, okay, I like going to the theater a lot. I'm going to buy some housing that's close to it because that's really handy. A number of people who are like me feel sort of the same. We drive housing prices up. So I get all of the results in your paper about the location of arts organizations, presence of artists, and house prices. And yet this is with the arts being, completely a private good with no positive spillovers at all. Have I missed a thing in here, or have I got that right?
No, I mean, I think the question of how do you interpret this as evidence in favor of externalities or not is a great question. And it's one that I try to take a little bit lighter because, yeah, as you said, this is a paper mainly about can you find a willingness to pay for arts and cultural amenities? And if so, how large is it? And where is it potentially heterogeneous? And then Doug, for example, raised the point about by income. The table 6 in the main paper looks at, well, so for those that, because I didn't mention it in the presentation, so I'm glad that you raised it. So there's, I use variation in the designation of cultural districts and the timing which a county got designated as a cultural district. And then I basically do like a diff and diff, and I show some evidence of parallel trends, et cetera, et cetera. And so most of the effect is concentrated. So most of the appreciation in property values takes place in areas where art is expanding in these cultural districts. You also see, though, just an overall effect for cultural district designation. To really pin down externalities, which is maybe a separate paper, one would have to see, is there a spillover, like a spatial spillover? And I think that's exactly what you were getting to, Michael, and that I don't speak as much about in this paper, but would be ripe for additional work to see. Yeah, do the neighborhoods next to it also reap some benefit in terms of economic or housing price activity? Yeah, so I totally agree with you that this is not super strong. This is not really evidence of spillovers. I think that maybe where I mentioned it at the beginning was more around motivation, that we tend to think about the arts also as having positive externalities, but this is more of a paper about here's evidence that individuals do value it. If that makes sense.
So can you describe a little bit, and this gets to Eve's comment in the chat, that rising housing prices are not seen as a positive by all. So,
Yeah,
seems like she's a cultural planner, and there's lots of fears of rising housing prices and cost of living. And so here you take, either an economic approach or a normative approach for assuming that rising housing prices are value. So can you comment a little bit about the possible detrimental effects or different ways we can interpret?
Yeah, no, I mean, it certainly is. And I mean, being in Athens, one of the big debates right now that's a big policy debate is actually around Airbnb, because many local Athenians are struggling really because of inflation and cost of living. And so Airbnb has led to a lot of pricing challenges, and now they're putting restrictions on actual Airbnb units. So it's something that, I mean, cities across the world, and it sounds like you've been grappling in real time with. So I think it's a very serious concern. The thing that makes me optimistic about these results is going back to Doug's question around, do you see it happening in areas where housing is constrained versus unconstrained? Because if housing prices appreciate, but there's also like development, the labor market's developing, prices are going up overall, the asset value is rising, and there is an expansion of housing supply, that's probably a good thing. But if housing prices are just going up and making it harder and harder for churn in the labor market and for all the things that are necessary for reallocation and competitive markets to take place, then that's not as good of a thing. So I guess the summary is just that I totally agree. It's a case-by-case basis. What this paper provides some evidence of is, in the average, it seems that these are genuine appreciation, not just driven by housing supply restrictions.
Right. And I think getting to Aisha's point too, you're looking at these county level effects. We are not at all understanding what the individual level effects are in these areas. So who's actually able to stay in these areas, who's actually able to afford these houses, et cetera, et cetera. But that could be a nice extension to obviously understanding what's going on.
Oh, definitely.
And
Yeah.
Tal, I think maybe we got to your question already, so I might skip that, but if I didn't, please put into the chat if you want something else. I want to ask you, Christos, so a great deal of literature has looked at this question, not only about the relationship between arts amenities and housing prices, but arts amenities and other economic and social indicators of communities, neighborhoods, regions. I mean, there's a pretty large discourse on it right now, especially in urban policy, urban planning. I think maybe less so of a discourse and a literature on really trying to, and I think we're going forward in this area, but less so in trying to really understand what the value is to the arts and how much people are not only willing to pay for it, but how do we value the arts? And I think now there's a great deal of work, especially in the European context, that's trying to figure out cultural valuation, maybe building on previous papers that have a lot to do with contingent valuation, but now looking at it in different ways. So I'm wondering, taking your paper and aligning it with the rest of the literature in both urban planning and urban policy, and also valuation of culture, what do we learn? What did you contribute here? What are you trying to fill the gaps with? How does your paper align with the rest of these two pieces of literature, or maybe others that you see that your paper relates to more?
Yeah, definitely. So, and by all means, if there's papers that I'm not referencing that I should be referencing, welcome any emails from participants here that end up watching it. I seem to be adding and finding kind of new papers all the time, and there's a lot of work that's out there. So the main contribution I'm trying to make here is that there's a couple like gold standard papers that people would say on like school quality, air pollution. You have like Che and Greenstone papers about hazardous waste sites. Air quality and so on. I mean, I guess they actually, it was Greenstone and Gallagher. And so what I'd like to provide some really strong evidence of is causal evidence of marginal willingness to pay. And then here's the areas that seem to benefit and seem to value it more than others. And so I've seen a number of studies that will sometimes like look at a subset of the market or over a certain time frame. And even the cultural districts literature is very useful because they have nice time series variation. But this is providing over like a little over 2 decades. It's using the entire United States. It's using a number of different causal identification methods. And so my hope is that the main takeaway is really around here's a causal estimate of how much people value arts and cultural amenities. And then there's many other open questions around, okay, what types of amenities? And as you said, around city planning, what sorts of amenities, because arts and culture is so broad and the creative sector includes many different subsectors. So it's certainly not to be exhaustive, but that's where I'm hoping the main contribution would lie.
Okay, so what do you see? Are there particular gaps that you see right now in the literature that that you're trying to fill that we just simply don't know? Because I think, we do know a little bit about the arts. We know that there's this chicken and egg problem where, that we've been discussing for most of the time. That, it's definitely, there's an aspect of the arts having these positive overall economic impacts, but also at the same time, that these economic impacts or economic investments in regions are driving this investment in the art. So what is it? So is part of your contribution trying to parse that out a little bit more?
Yeah, very much. I mean, so I think that there's like a lot of evidence that certainly these amenities that people care about the amenities. But as far as I know, and I mean, if there's a paper again that I maybe missed, is there like what would be the like if I was a city planner and I was like trying to determine for my city what average willingness to pay would be and trying to think through these things, if there's a baseline estimate that one would take and trying to provide that baseline, at least for the United States. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, part of what we do here obviously is get an understanding of what everybody's working on, but also an understanding about how the work that we see in the workshop is helping to advance our overall field. So that's where the motivation for my question came from, is how are we thinking about this advancing our overall knowledge about cultural affairs, about the value of the arts, about the impact of the arts, all these questions that are, again, in our orbit, but all of the papers that we see on this workshop help address in different ways. So there's the motivation for my question. Hope it didn't throw you off at all.
Oh, no, that's great. No, totally. And I know that we're running up on time, but I'll just say, yeah, by all means, anyone that has additional thoughts or questions that this spurs, don't hesitate to send along. Thank you, Michael, as well. I just saw your comment about the cultural districts, and I appreciate that comment. And yes, there's probably a lot of heterogeneity and designation. And let's see, maybe there's one more Attila comment if we have time. It'd be nice to see the development of results in areas that are.
Yeah, I think he gets
Yeah,
this indigeneity effect that we've been
yeah,
talking about a lot. So definitely the idea that, and this is hard to do, right, from a matching or randomization standpoint to see which one of those regions, and I think urban policy scholars have tried to do this, which one of those regions can we sort of use as a treatment versus a control, very hard to do, but great.
and I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, in one sense, there's always going to be, I mean, oftentimes the causality runs both ways. And then the question is like, how do we pin down how much is one effect versus another? And so I certainly agree, like, until your comment that it's like, if you have a strong artistic community in one area, that will attract more. And so, yeah, then the public policy question is, well, how do you build that maybe initial community, or how do you put additional spark behind it? But in any case, I know that we're on time. Thanks, Eve, and thanks everybody that's been here. Thank you, Joanna, so much again, and really thoughtful questions and suggestions.
Great. Thank you, Christos. It was a pleasure having you. And thank you all for joining in the conversation. I hope you'll join us again in a couple weeks. We'll have Min Lee, who is a PhD student here, and Michael Rushton, who is not a PhD student here, talking about their chapters in innovating institutions and inequities in the arts. And I hope you'll join us again. So thank you again, Christos. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.